For our next speaker, John Cobb, we have an introduction from Wes Jackson, President of the Land Institute.
John Cobb was born in Kobe, Japan, 90 years ago, 1925, to parents who were Methodist missionaries. Until he was 15, he lived primarily in Kobe and Hiroshima and received most of his early education in a multi-ethnic Canadian academy in Kobe. And from that, he attributes the beginnings of his pluralistic outlook. 1940, John Cobb moved to Georgia in this USA to finish high school. And he found himself both bewildered and disgusted by the perverse racism in the region, particularly the demonization of the Japanese. Seeing how the same events could be presented in such different ways based on the country in which he was living, Cobb became ever more countercultural and suspicious of governments. He's one of the two most important North American theologians in the 20th century. It's been said he's often regarded as the preeminent scholar in the field of process philosophy, process theology, and the school of thought associated with Alfred North Whitehead's thinking. More than 50 books, and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. A unifying theme of his work is his emphasis on ecological interdependence, the idea that every part of the ecosystem is reliant on all the other parts. He's argued that our most urgent task is to preserve the world on which it lives and depends, and that idea come as a result of being influenced by philosopher and mathematician Alfred North Whitehead, which is described as world loyalty. He's a transdisciplinary guy, integrating insights from many different areas of study, different specialized disciplines, and so on. Been influenced in a wide range. He's influenced a wide range of disciplines: theology, ecology, economics, biology, social ethics. John Cobb's been here before, twice. He is the co-founder and the current co-director of the Center for Process Studies in Claremont, California. And way back in 77, I was reading some of Whitehead, I think as a result of reading John Cobb, and I was struck by the sentence that the essence of dramatic tragedy lies not in unhappiness, but in the remorseless, inevitable working of things. It is, however, through people that it's experienced as unhappiness at times. And that was a sentence that caused me to think about agriculture. Is it in the nature of a dramatic tragedy? We have to have food, and yet it undercuts, annual grain agriculture undercuts the very basis of its own existence. That was largely the result of having been attracted to John Cobb and Alfred North Whitehead. Another way that we need to think about John Cobb is his connection with Herman Daly, a steady state economists, and their thick volume, Our Common Future, in which they took on the problem of the doctrine of misplaced concreteness. John Cobb is sufficiently concrete that he knows where the concrete is in economics, and we need to bust it up. Thank you.
That very last comment reminded me of one of the things I read about Wes Jackson in a magazine. I can't even think what the magazine was, but that was an article in which declared Wes Jackson is half prophet and half buffalo. The buffalo, both of them do a lot of busting up, so I think I look forward to that. Well, I am so happy to be here, and I appreciate Wes Jackson so much that he would be one of the last people in the world I could say no to, but I didn't want to say no, so that wasn't the problem. I consider that what you have been, you all, and I think all of you are supporters, so I'll just say all of us have been doing here through him and his assistants may turn out to be the most important event of the 20th century, 21st century now. He has understood the depth of the problem of feeding humanity and the possibility of tragedy, as he has just described it, and has done something about it, while for most people that was a kind of remote and unlikely topic of even conversation. And that ability to identify what the deepest problems are, and then to give oneself to it, even though you won't get much social support for doing so, and sticking to it for all this time, it's an incomparable gift to all of us. And then I'm grateful for being asked to address the topic. It is a topic which has been very important to me for a very long time, but almost always when it's talked about in the United States, eyes glaze over very quickly. The idea that fundamental beliefs one is hardly conscious of because you take these things so for granted, really are very important in shaping what happens in the world, is one that seems evidently true to me, but it is just off the map for most people, at least especially in the United States. We are much more inclined to be anti-theoretical or ideological, and to think that the important thing is to identify the immediate, visible problem and figure out how to solve it and get the job done. And I certainly am not going to say we don't need to do that. But the sad thing has been, while we were solving 1,000 problems, the ship has been sinking. And if you don't pay attention to keeping the ship afloat, solving all the problems that make the ship run well are not going to amount to too much. Now, one of the ways the ship could sink is that food supply will disappear. We've already talked about that. There are a number of other ways in which the ship could sink. I'm not going to spend my time talking about the enormous threats. I think all of you have heard those speeches often enough. But the distinctive thing about my perspective, my distinctive contribution, I want to do a lot of other things beside this. We've got to deal with the practical problems when they come up. I'm not against that. But unless we understand that a way we have been taught to think, the way our universities in general teach us to think, is preventing us from actually behaving in the way that might really save us. Unless we really come to understand that, I'm not very optimistic that our practical ingenuity will take care of us. Now, I am very enthusiastic about the Pope's encyclical. I'm enthusiastic about many things he does. It is brilliant in many ways, but of course I responded to it with particular pleasure because he highlighted just that problem with our present way of thinking that I consider the most serious problem, and he pointed toward a change that is exactly the heart of the change with which I'm interested. So let me very briefly say what I think you can find in the encyclical, and then expand on that a little bit. He repeatedly emphasizes in that encyclical that we are interconnected with each other and interdependent. He repeatedly emphasizes that our environment is also completely interconnected and interdependent. And then he says, and we humans and that environment are also completely interconnected and interdependent. I think lots of people know that. But maybe they don't realize that the belief system that guides our governments, our educational system, our scientific technology, much of even our religious life, is not the one that we must have. It thinks that the world is made up of separable objects and entities, that there can be a lot of separate topics of investigation. Maybe that is the easiest one to understand if you have been to a university. Academic disciplines assume they can't exist in their present form without assuming that you can look at the totality of things and draw a circle about one part of it. And then your job is to do research that would increase the amount of information we have about that. And they do a great job in doing that. Again, I always worry when I criticize something that you'll think I'm just damning it completely or wiping it off the map. No, the academic disciplines have achieved a great deal of research. The amount of information we have is enormous. Sometimes I think it's so overwhelming it almost is too much that it just drives us about. I don't want to go off on a tangent like that. That's not that's not what I'm interested in doing. But this is not the only way you could organize knowledge. You see, if you do it this way, then you have specialized information about many different things, but you have no information about how they're connected with each other. The idea is then you have interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary work, but you put together specialists in a lot of disciplines, and you get a lot of specialized knowledge. You still don't understand that every one of those disciplines has narrowed the horizon of view in looking at its content. Whereas, in fact, everything that it studies is connected with many, many things that it doesn't study. And when you ignore that, you can have a great deal of knowledge, but no wisdom. Now, this has been connected with the idea that everything is objective. The world is composed of objects. Now, what is an object? An object is the sort of thing you see and touch. And the things that you see and touch can be separated from each other and looked at individually. But subjects play no role in the modern worldview. If you're looking for as an explanation of anything, if in that explanation you include a human decision, you are no longer being scientific. The task of science is finally to explain that human beings are important as physical objects that move around in the world, but their subjective experience is not an explanation of anything that happens. That's the worldview we are taught. This worldview excludes values. By values, I just mean the idea that some things are better than other things. If you have values, these are prejudices, and you're not allowed to bring them into the classroom. And the university as a whole does not discriminate some things as being, it does in fact, but officially, some things as being important and other things less important. A book written by Stanley Fish to teachers, especially this was be to university professors, is entitled Save the World on Your Own Time. Okay, and he means it. And I happen to be a Methodist and the president of a Methodist university, one that I used to teach at, Emory University in Georgia, is retiring. And the article he wrote was about character. But then he says, of course, this is not something you deal with in the classroom. And he quotes Stanley Fish especially as pointing out, you shouldn't introduce any of your concerns of that kind in the classroom. Okay, I'm saying there is a dominant worldview, and if anyone is called an expert, in all probability, they have been brainwashed into that worldview. It's very hard to get a PhD without accepting the implicit worldview that underlies what you're doing. Okay, I happen to think that's a very serious problem. This is not a criticism of individual professors. If you want a job in a university, you need to play by the rules of the university. And every now and again, some professors break out of that. Some professors who taught ecology back in the 60s broke out of that. And the word ecological became a household name. Some professors of climate have recently broken out of that. They clearly think there's some value in preventing the climate of the world from being totally changed. So you understand, nobody would write a book telling professors, don't worry about saving the world, if no professors were interested in saving the world. But my experience is that professors know that they need to do this kind of thing cautiously on their own time or something of that kind. In my view, education should be about wisdom. And wisdom should be about dealing with the deepest problems of human beings. Wisdom involves value judgments just as much as it involves factual information. Now, I could go through the history of how this happened. And at no stage are there bad guys doing things, intentionally trying to corrupt us or destroy us, but good solutions to problems which are then thought of as the final solution to that problem. The unqualified solution to that problem usually end up creating as many or more problems. So if you're curious, I'll just say the two hero villains of my piece are Rene Descartes and Immanuel Kant. Okay, Descartes is the father of modern philosophy, and he taught that nature is all to be understood materialistically and mechanistically. The model that he and others enjoyed was the Strasbourg Clock. Now, the medievals were very skilled technologists, and especially they had developed very complex clockwork. And so every hour or so, well, every hour or less than that, more frequently, If you watch, I think to this day, if you go and watch the clock at Strasbourg, or many other clocks actually, you'll see figures come out and dance around. Okay, they dance around as if they were living, but in fact, they're purely machines. Now, Descartes took that as a model, and he thought your dog was also a machine that danced around for mechanical reasons. And so the whole world studied by the natural scientist had no values in itself. It had values only for people. And everything in that world must be understood in this objectivist, reductionist way. Okay. Now, it turned out philosophically that there were all kinds of problems with this. Hume undercut it all. He showed that these people, the scientists, all assumed that there were objective causes. Some events or some things caused other things, but that in fact all we could ever observe in our objects were successions of events. Well, the scientists always meant more by cause. I mean, they didn't say day caused night, night causes day. You see, that's a very regular succession. But no, cause meant one thing made something else happen. But by the philosophical principles, they couldn't do that. So Kant came to the rescue, and he said, this is the only way the human mind can think. So if you want knowledge, if you want information, you've got to think the way Descartes told us to think. Now, at least Descartes thought that the human was excluded. The human soul is not part of this mechanical world. Therefore, you could still have values. You just didn't, your pets didn't have values. The natural world didn't have any values. And of course, our economic theory is all based on that idea that the only value of anything except the human being is its value to human beings. How much the human being will pay for it in the marketplace. That kind of thinking flows from these kinds of assumptions. But Kant saw that Hume was right. You can't give any evidence in favor of this worldview. Therefore, but you need it, and it works wonderfully for doing science. So it just must be built into the brain, and we don't have any choice about it. So stop thinking about it. Now, Kant also believed that practical thinking was entirely different from theoretical thinking. And the practical thinking is all about values. So he separated the world of fact from the world of value. Now, the university used to have in Germany the Naturwissenschaften and the Geisteswissenschaften. The Geist means mind or spirit. And when you were doing Geisteswissenschaften, you had values. When you're doing Naturwissenschaft, no values. Never the twain. Don't do that anymore. Now, I think that was pretty bad. But the situation became worse as a result of evolution. When we learned that we are part of nature, then that implied that we too are part of the great machine. And it is to this day the job of the neuroscientists to show that all of our subjective experience is simply the result of what's happening neuronally. They haven't succeeded. In fact, all the evidence works the opposite way, but evidence doesn't count when you settle in a metaphysics. People just don't understand that metaphysics is the most important and most practical of all forms of thinking. Because unless you figure out what your metaphysics is and criticize it, you are simply the slave of that metaphysics. Okay, so as you can see, I think these ideas, metaphysics is a word that's hardly usable in public in this country. But you understand, as long as we don't ever speak of it, we have no way of critiquing the dominant structures of our society, which are based on what I consider to be a very bad metaphysics. Okay. Well, if you think in those terms, then the possibility of dividing everything up from each other, learning about it, and then just adding that to what you learn here and here, that would work. But the Pope emphasizes everything is interconnected with everything else. I emphasize it too. I appreciate having support from a very, very important person. Yeah. I learned it especially from Whitehead. But the truth is, everybody already knows it. It's just that we are not allowed to build anything on it, and that we are supposed to do things another way. I think everybody knows that animals have feelings. But our business, the way our meat is manufactured today, is entirely consistent with Cartesian ways of thinking. We have industrialized everything, and industry, of course, is another expression of that worldview. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to undo all of industry, but actually I think that the newest developments in science, and I mean the last 50 years or more, undercut the adequacy of this worldview for the sciences. It's very interesting. Quantum theory is called quantum mechanics, but there's nothing mechanical about it. It just expresses the fact we are bound to force these ideas on subject matters like human experience, but they don't fit. But until we explicitly recognize they don't fit, that we are teaching our children the wrong thing. Our school system is based on brainwashing. I'm not blaming any individual. Please don't think if you're a teacher that I think you are brainwashing your children. But the whole expertise that produces the literature that we teach and the way the structure of the whole thing is set up has that effect. Okay, I think it makes a huge difference. I'm very glad that the Pope has addressed it. I'm hoping that this will generate serious conversations. I'm going to tell you about my personal experience, which is satisfying, is in China. Now, China, the Chinese don't have this notion that ideas, basic ideas don't matter much, because in the course of 100 years, the last 100 years, they have been swept from one way of thinking to another, and they know it does matter. About 100 years ago, the new Chinese government overthrew the Chinese emperors and established a country that was self-consciously copied on the American Revolution. Sun Yat-sen was called the George Washington of China. Okay. Quite a number of countries looked to the American Revolution as their model. And his ideals were Western ideals based on the Enlightenment. And of course, the Enlightenment generally introduced what we might call the bourgeois Enlightenment. There were, at the time of the Enlightenment, also some radical voices, but they did not play a large role. So China shifted from being a feudal society based on Confucianism or something that called, when I say Christianity, you understand, I don't mean necessarily exactly what Jesus thought. I mean what Christianity had become in later times. Same with Confucianism. It was not exactly what Confucius would say. But nevertheless, Confucianism was the basic culture of China for a long, long time. And the new democracy that wanted to develop science and in the Western way and so forth thought we had to get rid of the power of Confucianism. They knew they couldn't really do it within a worldview as different as that. So the Chinese educated people went through a process of Westernization. Then there came the second step in that Westernization, which was the Communist Revolution. Well, it's still Enlightenment, But of course, it's quite different when you organize a society based on communism from the society that had been based on middle-class, democratic, and capitalist structures. So the Chinese went through that change. And then under Mao, they experienced the implications of some features of communism in ways that upset the middle class greatly. And although they did not overthrow communism officially, they no longer looked to Marx for much guidance. I say China is communist the way Sweden is Christian. But you still need to say good things about Marx if you want to score points in China. I happen to think that China is not Marxist enough, so I don't have any trouble with that. It now describes itself as a socialist market economy, and the market part is clearer than the social to me, unless by social you mean the government can't interfere more than it can in other cultures. But this was another huge shift in China since in the post-Mao period is based on very fundamentally different views. It is now much more trying out the Western or American system of not having any ideology. But having had so much ideology, so consciously, many Chinese feel this as a gap. Now, the intellectuals in China became unhappy because the only ideology China had was to be modern. And the intellectuals in Europe were writing about how bad modern is. So the intellectuals in China hated to think that they were devoting all of their energies to achieve all the problems that the European intellectuals were pointing out in Europe. And so this is called post-modernism, okay? But the European post-modernism, centering in France, did not deal with any of the problems that modernity was directly creating in China, above all ecological problems. So China was industrializing brilliantly, but people couldn't breathe any longer. And so if postmodern doesn't have any effect on issues of that kind, it wasn't very satisfactory. Well, if for that reason, I think I have a little more time, okay. For that reason, there was openness to the theoretical positions to which I subscribe, okay. My colleague David Griffin called our view constructive postmodernism. The French use the word deconstruction a great deal. Now, you can't construct without some deconstruction, but our goal is to construct and offer something better rather than just to show what's wrong with what you have. And he edited a series of books, 30 books actually, called A Series in Constructive Postmodernism. In this country, of course, no one paid, very few people paid any attention. I sometimes exaggerate, so, okay. But in China, just because people were looking for something, and they liked being postmodern, but they didn't like the fact that the French postmodernists didn't help them any with their problems, they read the books in his series. The first book in his series was called The Re-Enchantment of Science. And that book in China led to several national conferences. And a man from China who was the literary, in charge of all the publications of the National Academy of Social Sciences, came to Claremont to study. And he took his PhD with David. And in the meantime, we translated, he got a few other books translated into Chinese and other things, and he decided to stay. Well, to put a long story short, he has made constructive postmodernism, which is a theory of interconnectedness, to try to tie it back to where we were before, a very influential force in China. More than 25 universities have set up centers to study this. I don't know that much of importance happens in the centers, but that universities want to have centers of this kind shows a kind of status that is very different from in this country. I will be going to China again the end of this month, and I have been asked to go because I am identified in China with the work against the industrialization of agriculture. Okay. So there were, of course, Chinese who were opposed to doing away with thousands of villages, which is what the government's getting ready to. The government's actually built whole cities that are completely empty because they thought they had to transfer the rest of their rural population into cities. Well, I hope they stand empty for a long time. We can't be sure. I'm going to a conference. I went to it last year. This is the second time they've done it, which is an indication they are not backing off. It is the Department of Governance in China that is sponsoring them. And that's a very high level of sponsorship. And these conferences are about rural development. And this is the alternative to industrial agriculture. Now, why were they going in the direction of industrial agriculture? Because they sent their brightest and best to America to get educated. And they didn't learn about anything except industrial agriculture. So naturally, when they went back, Now, I'm not trying to say that this issue is now settled, that there's no further danger. The many peasant villages are not very attractive places to live right now. And a lot of the people there would move to the city in flat if they had a chance. So unless China will really invest in the developing of their cities and of their peasant villages, and I'm sure all of you have some ideas about what that means. It's a tremendous task. But last year, when I was there, most of the sessions were devoted to good examples that people are excited about. Here and there, villages have come alive, and people want to go back to them, and so forth. So at least we have problematized. I had the advantage of coming as an American who said the United States made a terrible mistake. You don't have to imitate it. I think you can see that's a good role for an American to play because they understand some Chinese just want to keep the old stuff. That's too bad, but we can't pay too much attention. But if Americans say that, I'm trying to get Wes Jackson to go and say that. Right. To me, this is a clear example that if you follow the dominant modern metaphysics and ideology, in spite of many individually good things, you will carry us further and further into a self-destructive situation. 500 million more people moving into Chinese cities, turning all Chinese agriculture over to fossil fuels. These are not promising for the future of the planet. And they are terribly destructive culturally as well. So, I hope that you will take ideas seriously. Just take the Pope's encyclical seriously, and you will have to take ideas seriously. And then we'll find that, in fact, that's the way you've been thinking all along. It's not hard. You know things are interconnected. And you know that it is not healthy to isolate agriculture from everything else, that is just food production. That, when you say, how can we produce the most food most easily, with the fewest people, zip, of course. But if the way you produce food, if the people who are involved in it, if their community lives, if the culture of the whole country, and if the health of the soil, and if the possibility of adapting to the water shortages that are coming on us in China very, very painfully, very, very soon. If you also think about those things, industrializing agriculture makes no sense at all. Keep those glasses on. Don't be fooled by the experts. Follow Wes Jackson. We're home free. Thank you.